this lecture, we're going to look at the events of what has commonly come to be called Bloody Sunday, Sunday the 21st of November 1920 in Dublin, one of the most iconic days of the Irish War of Independence. The title for the lecture is a quote from an official in Dublin Castle writing in his diary that night, when he described it as a day of black murder. The official in question was a senior British civil servant who had been brought over as part of a group to try and get some control on the administration in Dublin Castle called Mark Sturgis. He's the man sitting on the extreme right as we look at this photo. And he kept a diary, and his diary is very interesting because it gives us a genuine contemporary account of Bloody Sunday. He was writing this diary entry in Dublin Castle that night as news of the events was starting to trickle out. Now, obviously, he's writing mostly from the British perspective, so his concern was for the intelligence officers who were killed by Collins's squad earlier that day. But you get a sense of what started off as a fairly ordinary Sunday morning. After breakfast, Jonathan, Dickie and I, he's talking about some of his colleagues there. Jonathan was Sir John Anderson, the senior civil servant in Dublin Castle, walked up to the stables, and after looking around the boxes, went to the garden. So they're just having an ordinary Sunday, lazy Sunday in Dublin, and then news of what happened in the houses where the British intelligence officers were staying started to come in. So you get a very good sense of how the shock evolved in real time, almost, by reading that contemporary account of the event. Now, of course, he focuses mostly on the killings of his colleagues, but it's worth looking, I think, at the death toll of that day to get an extent of the sheer extent of how many people died in Dublin on that day. And here we owe a lot to the work of Jane Leonard, who's written a very good short article on the dead of Bloody Sunday in an edited collection called Terror in Ireland, but also to the recent excellent compendium of fatalities during this period, The Dead of the Irish Revolution, edited by Ewan O'Halpin and Daithí O'Crone, which appeared just in recent weeks. The total casualty for the island of Ireland on that day of the 21st of November 1920 was 41. Of the British cohort, those who died in the attacks by the squad in the morning, on Sunday morning, 7 were intelligence officers, 2 were court-martial officers, 1 was a soldier, 2 were members of the auxiliary division of the RIC, 1 was regular RIC, and there were 2 civilians, one of whom was the unfortunate landlord of one of the intelligence officers, and he just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Later that afternoon, as we know, 14 civilians died as a result of the shootings by the Black and Tans at Croke Park. Later, further in the evening, 2 high-ranking members of the Dublin Brigade of the IRA, Dick McKee and Peadar Clancy, who had been captured earlier in the day, were tortured and killed at Dublin Castle. A number of other civilians in different parts of the country were killed, one of whom was Conor Clune, who was in the company of McKee and Clancy. 5 different members of the Crown Forces were killed in various locations, including one who took his life in Dublin Castle that night. Now, the death toll for the day is 41. Now, some of those deaths are attributed to the early hours of the 22nd of November 1920. I have included them all for this date because whether they died on the 21st or the following day, they died as a result of injuries inflicted during that day. So that alone, I think, gives us an extent of just how much of a shock the events of this day came to people living at the time. I have categorized Conor Clune as a civilian, and he's generally accepted as such. He was a Gaelic League organiser from Clare who was in Dublin apparently in Gaelic League business. Now, in recent years, a pension file has been released for a pension that was awarded to his mother. And in that, it suggests that Clune was in Dublin to meet Collins, which indicates some potential involvement in the Republican movement. Now, that's very hard to verify, and possibly given that point of that file was for his widowed mother to get some compensation from the state. There may have been an effort to indicate that he was in some way involved to increase her chances of him getting some money. So we're not altogether sure on Clune if he was involved in the Republican movement, but if he was unlikely to be a very senior figure in it. The general sense is that he was probably just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I think it's important to track back a little bit before November 1920 and to try and look at this day and how it evolved in the wider context of the War of Independence until that point. Of course, January 1919 is often highlighted as the start date of the War of Independence. That coincidence of the first meeting of the first Dáil taking place the same day as the Solohead Beg ambush. But the Solohead Beg ambush was undoubtedly a one-off event, and it did not set off any major series of military activities by the IRA, either in Tipperary or elsewhere in the country. Much of the activity of the Republican movement throughout 1919 was focused on political efforts. Soon after it met, the Dáil nominated a delegation to make Ireland's case to the peace conference. And also much of 1919 was taken up with Collins as Minister for Finance trying to raise the national loan. And at local level, a lot of Irish volunteers were involved in those efforts as well. So much of the first half or first 9 months of 1919 was largely devoted to the political side of the campaign. The military side of the campaign was stepped up then in the autumn and the winter of 1919. Partly a sense that the political efforts weren't getting anywhere because Seán T. O'Kelly and the Irish delegation were getting no hearing at the Paris Peace Conference. The British then suppressed the Dáil and a number of other Republican organisations, and this was seen as leaving the Republican movement with little option but to escalate the military side of the campaign. And two events which indicate that the military side was becoming more serious were the attack on British soldiers attending the Methodist Church in Fermoy by Liam Lynch's IRA brigade, which resulted in the death of one of them, and the failed effort at the end of December 1919 to assassinate the Lord Lieutenant, Lord French, at the Ashtown Gate of the Phoenix Park. So we get a sense by the end of 1919 that things are escalating quite significantly on the military side of the campaign. And we really see that at the start of the year 1920. In response to an IRA General Headquarters General Order urging local IRA units to attack RIC barracks, there's a significant rise in the number of both occupied and unoccupied RIC barracks attacked by local IRA units from January 1920 onwards. And there's a number of reasons for this. At the end of 1919, the RIC had vacated a number of its smaller outposts because they were isolated and they were vulnerable to attack. A lot of those isolated posts were then attacked and burned by the IRA to make sure that the RIC never reoccupied them again. But there were other very valid reasons in the context of guerrilla warfare for the IRA focusing its campaign against the Royal Irish Constabulary. They were the most visible manifestation of British authority in Ireland. As an armed police force, they were a very useful source of arms and ammunition for the IRA, which was not well equipped in that way itself. But they also performed an important intelligence function at local level. Local policemen knew who the senior figures in the Republican movement were, and that was a level of intelligence that the IRA wanted to eliminate. The attack on probably the best example or the most successful example of these assaults on police was on Easter Sunday 1920, when about 300 unoccupied police barracks and other government buildings throughout the country were destroyed. So that was a significant coup for the military side of the Republican movement. But this assault on law and order was not limited to merely the physical attacks on the infrastructure of the Royal Irish Constabulary. The Dáil had instituted a boycott of the RIC, so that Irish people were encouraged not to interact socially with the RIC at all. The RIC, which was largely composed of Irish men, the majority of whom were Catholics, many of them were also encouraged to leave their posts, to resign or to retire from the force. So there was a strong effort to contribute to this neutralisation of the RIC by ostracising it socially as a force. This extended not just to the members of the force themselves, but also to their families, where local shopkeepers refused to serve them and people just refused to have any social interaction with them. A further attack on British law and order generally came in the ongoing success of the Republican courts. An alternative system of justice had evolved in the west of Ireland around 1917 or 1918 to deal with land disputes which had arisen. The Republican movement, Sinn Féin, was concerned that local land difficulties could detract attention from the overriding aim of achieving Irish independence. So local arbitration courts were set up in an effort to solve these disputes before they could get out of hand. When the Dáil was established in 1919, then it took control of these Republican or Dáil courts and established a framework of parish, district and circuit courts. By the middle of 1920, these courts were operating openly and largely supplanting the existing British Crown courts in large parts of the country. So what we see by the middle of 1920 is very much the Republican movement has the upper hand in a number of areas. Partly the success of the Republican movement owes something to the British government taking its eye off the ball in Ireland. That's understandable when you think that for much of 1919, the British government's focus was elsewhere. It was in Versailles with the completion of the peace treaties, and it was also domestically at home in Britain as the government sought to accommodate millions of returning ex-servicemen and find jobs for them in an economy which was undergoing a severe economic downturn after the end of the boom created by the First World War. But eventually, in the middle of 1920, the British realised how bad things were getting in Ireland. The boycott of the RIC was leading to significant retirements and resignations from the force, leading to a serious manpower concern. The Crown courts were under threat from the Republican courts, which were supplanting them. And the military campaign of the IRA was leaving smouldering RIC barracks in large parts of the country as a sign that these were areas of the country where British law and order did not run, the British writ did not run anymore. So we see a major change in British policy in 1920, particularly in the middle of 1920. But it starts even earlier. It starts in January 1920 with an effort to address the manpower deficiency in the RIC, with the introduction of a new type of constable to the RIC force, which a group we would now refer to as the Black and Tans. A name deriving from the mix match of disused bottle green Irish RIC uniforms and surplus British Army khaki uniforms. They were introduced to bolster the declining numbers of the RIC in January 1920. They were augmented then later in the autumn of 1920 with another force, slightly separate from the RIC, a mobile policing force, or paramilitary force, which was intended to travel around the country in Crossley tenders and be a more mobile effort to challenge the IRA units. These were the auxiliary division of the RIC, which started to be recruited in the summer of 1920 and throughout the autumn and the winter of 1920 arrived in Ireland weekly and were dispatched to various locations, largely in the southern counties. But the response of the British government wasn't just on the side of the Crown forces. Certainly they needed more manpower, but we see a wider response. We see it's certainly a security response in that way. We also see an administrative response. Part of the reason why the British were losing ground to the Republican campaign in 1920 was because those responsible for the implementation of British policy in Ireland, the senior staff in Dublin Castle, were simply not up to the job. In the spring of 1920, a senior British civil servant, Sir Warren Fisher, was sent over to Dublin Castle to investigate it. He produced quite a scathing report about the inefficiency and incompetence of the senior civil administrative cadre in Dublin Castle. This led to their replacement with a group of much more senior British civil servants, some of whom I've mentioned before: John Anderson, Mark Sturgis, Andy Cope. They were brought in to get a handle on Dublin Castle and to try to make the British response in Ireland more effective than it had been up until that time. Another area where the British strengthened their hand in dealing with the insurgency in Ireland was through legislation. And coercive legislation was introduced in August 1920. This was the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act. And this swept away a lot of the standard rights that people would normally have in a society not at war. So, for instance, coroners' courts were replaced with military courts of inquiry. That was because local juries drawn from local communities often refused to return verdicts which would please the British in cases where Crown forces were shot. Much more severe penalties were introduced, and internment was allowed in certain cases as well. So we have a panoply of measures brought in by the British throughout the first half, and particularly in the middle of 1920, to try and get a better handle on the insurgency in Ireland. There's a general sense that they were losing ground through the spring and the summer of 1920, and they certainly hit back as that year went on. Another area where the British tried to bolster their forces was in the area of intelligence. As Director of Intelligence of the IRA, Michael Collins had quite an effective network of spies. He had a couple of people, but not at the highest level, it must be said, in Dublin Castle. Likewise, he had some people within the G Division of the Dublin Metropolitan Police. But I think it's an important caveat to make that while Collins managed to recruit some of these well-known spies like David Nelligan and Ned Broy, he never really managed to turn anyone at a very high level. The highest informant he had within the RIC went no higher than head constable. So yes, he was successful in putting together a good intelligence network, but I think it's important that we don't overplay the significance of it. But in addition to these spies he had in crucial locations around Dublin, he also had a very good local intelligence network. Every IRA brigade had its own intelligence officer, and when Collins's people would get the codes to break British ciphers, those would be distributed to all the local intelligence officers, and they, in league with local postmistresses, were often able to decipher communications, often before the Crown forces for whom these communications were intended had got them themselves. So Collins had a quite successful intelligence network going, and this was another area where the British felt that they needed to up their game to match him. And another change we see in British policy in Ireland was the introduction of stronger intelligence measures. A new intelligence guru at Dublin Castle, Sir Ormond Winter, was brought in, and he recruited various intelligence officers from Britain, the best known of these being the so-called Cairo Gang, some of whom were the ones who were targeted on the morning of Bloody Sunday, 1920. So that brings us up to speed with where we are in the autumn and going into the winter of 1920. And Bloody Sunday, the events of Bloody Sunday have their origins in Collins's desire to eliminate these new British spies which were brought over by Winter in the summer and autumn of 1920. And Collins was lucky in one regard here, that he had one very well placed but very unobtrusive spy, and this was a typist in Dublin Castle called Lily Mernin. Lily Mernin, coincidentally or conveniently for Collins, happened to be a distant cousin of a member of IRA GHQ, Pierce Beasley, who was the editor of the IRA Journal on Thoglock and a close associate of Collins. Of course, Beasley later went on to be Collins's first biographer. But Lily Mernin was well placed. She was a typist in Dublin Castle, so she had one of the lowest clerical posts in the castle, but she had connections which her bosses never knew about. So as she talks about when she was recruited, Beasley recruited her to pass information from the castle to him, which he then relayed to Collins. And in her application for a military service pension, sections of which I've shared here on the screen. She describes what her activities were. She was asked to get Collins' addresses and supply him with descriptions of British officers, intelligence officers and others in Dublin Castle as far as possible, and also to get the addresses and descriptions of any Castle employees, so we can get a sense of how Collins was working here. Now, it's important, a point to be made at this stage is we see a serious weakness in British strategy here. And perhaps they didn't realise how serious the conflict in Ireland had got at this point, because you would have to ask yourself, why were these people living out in ordinary houses around Dublin? Why were greater security measures not taken by these British intelligence officers? And specifically with regard to Bloody Sunday, in her military service pension application and also in her Bureau of Military History statement, Lily Mernin set out what she did and how the information which she uncovered in the castle and subsequently relayed to Collins was central to him being able to carry out get the squad to carry out those attacks on that morning. In November, I obtained a list of all the private addresses of British GHQ officers and other officers residing outside barracks. And this list, I understand, was used in the shootings of Bloody Sunday, November the 21st, 1920. Again, you have to ask, much of the blame for Bloody Sunday being allowed to happen must be at the door of the British for not taking greater measures to protect their intelligence officers. And it was this list, it was this information, both the names and the addresses, which was crucial to enabling Collins' squad to target those men on that morning. And just to get a sense of where the events happened, and this slide contains a very useful map which was recently published in a supplement accompanying the Irish Independent on a special on Bloody Sunday. If you're familiar with the geography of Dublin, you get a sense of, I suppose, how confined these attacks were to a relatively small geographic area. And I think that helps us to explain the shock that someone like Mark Sturgis described feeling in his diary when news of these assaults came in. Most of the attacks on the British intelligence people were in Lower Mount Street. There was one in Moorhampton Road out in Donnybrook, which is probably one of the furthest out. Fitzwilliam Street, Pembroke Street, Ranelagh Road, Harcourt Street. If you're familiar with Dublin, those are our main thoroughfares, which everybody would be familiar with. It's worth, though, spending a bit of time looking as well at the people who carried out these assaults on that morning. The Trinity historian, Dr. Anne Dolan, has written some very interesting work, and for anyone who's seen the recent RTE TV documentary on Bloody Sunday, her contributions to that were quite insightful. But she has looked at the men responsible for carrying out these killings, and particularly at the traumatic effect which it had on them afterwards. And I've just highlighted the names of a few of the better known ones here. But what's really striking about it is just how young so many of these men were. Paddy Daly was one of the older ones. He was in his 30s, and the Leonards were in their mid-20s. But other than that, most of them, so many of them are 20 or 21, and even in Charlie Dalton's case, still a teenager. So I think that has to be one of the most striking features of this group of men, is just how young these men who went out to shoot men at close range were. And the squad, these were part of Collins' squad, a group of loyal volunteers who he had put together specifically for the purpose of eliminating his most dangerous enemies. They received no training. They were kept together in billets where they hidden away from sight in the hope that they wouldn't be identified. So it must have been a very strange atmosphere in which to operate. But undoubtedly what they did on that morning scarred many of them for the rest of their lives. And one in particular that I want to draw attention to, because we have some very interesting evidence about what I suppose we would today call post-traumatic stress disorder is in the case of Charlie Dalton from his recently released military service pension file, or in this case what's known as his army pension file, which is the file relating to pensions given when people were wounded. And there's a picture of Charlie Dalton and his older brother Emmett in their Free State uniform, probably from 1922. And even looking at that photo, you get a sense of just, I mean, he still looks like a kid in that photo. He still looks extremely youthful. And that's a few years later. That's about, I would say about 1922, because those are Free State Army uniforms. But Charlie Dalton's doctors, in 1941, when his wife Teresa was trying to get a pension and trying to get some medical help for her husband, there's some very interesting medical evidence on his condition 20 years after the fact. One of his psychiatrists said that he had known him from the age of 16 and was intimately acquainted with his activities since that time. All his impressions and hallucinations were referred back to those earlier days. I am therefore of opinion that his present condition is entirely due to his experiences during the years 1916 to 1922. Now, Charlie Dalton was born in 1903. If Dr. Barneville was treating him from the time he was 16, that suggests that he was starting to have these psychiatric problems even before Bloody Sunday. So you would have to question whether or not Charlie Dalton was an appropriate person to have involved in those activities. Another doctor described the symptoms he was suffering at the time in 1941. He is suffering from mixed psychosis, which has totally and probably permanently incapacitated him. The content of his delusional state has been throughout associated with the period of mental strain during his active service. Charlie Dalton was at the time in a psychiatric hospital. He also had a gunshot wound to his hand later, I think, in 1921. So he had physical as well as mental scars from this period. And while he did recover enough to leave hospital, he was deemed to be 100% incapacitated and was given a decent pension. Now, he did later become recovered well enough to leave hospital and was given a job working in the Irish hospital sweepstake with Joe McGrath, who the sweepstake was almost an employment bureau for many ex-revolutionaries. To what extent he was able to work to any great extent for the rest of his life, I'm not sure, but he certainly recovered enough to leave hospital. But his case is one of the best examples of the traumatic effect of Bloody Sunday on these young men. And another fascinating piece of evidence into which allows us to date much of his psychosis to the events themselves is this amazing letter from Seán Lemass when he was Minister of Supplies in 1941 to Teresa Dalton, to Charlie Dalton's wife. And in this, Lemass recounts specifically the effect of Bloody Sunday on Charlie Dalton on that night. And I'm just going to read a section from it because I think it is very telling. I first became seriously concerned about him, however, on the evening of Sunday, the 21st of November, 1920. On the morning of that day, a number of British government agents in Dublin were shot. It was your husband's duty to accompany a party of IRA to the houses occupied by 4 of the agents, all of whom were shot. He returned subsequently to the village at South William Street, and I realised that he had become unnerved by his experiences of the morning. He talks then about how Lemass and another volunteer tried to bring Dalton outside for a walk in the hope to clear his mind a bit, pointing out what a very risky thing that was to do, to be out and about in the streets of Dublin on that particular night. But they obviously felt he was so badly affected by it that they needed to try and do something to calm him down. And then he talks about when they went back in, that he was inclined to the hysterical. I recollect that a tap in the dispensary was leaking and making a gurgling noise. This noise apparently reminded your husband of a similar noise he had heard from the men who were shot. He shouted to us to stop the noise of the tap, and it was with difficulty that he was quieted. He goes on then to talk about how at this period your husband was very young and his experiences would could not but have left a permanent mark on him. And then Lemass tried to have Dalton moved somewhere else or taken off active service. But I think that letter tells, it's such, even though it's written by Lemass 20 years after the fact, the events were clearly imprinted on his mind, that he relates them in such fine detail. And it gives us a very interesting and a very emotive insight into Charlie Dalton's mind on that night as a result of what he had seen and what he had done earlier that day. But Charlie Dalton wasn't the only one where we can see serious trauma being experienced by these men afterwards. Paddy Daly, one of the more notorious members of the squad, will be better known for his role in the Dublin Guards in setting up the Ballyseedy ambush, the Ballyseedy massacre in Kerry during the Civil War, where he tied Republican suspects to a landmine and killed all but one of them. Daly, during his time in Kerry, was also responsible for an assault on two sisters, the McCarthy sisters, where soldiers beat them up with their Sam Brown belts, often known as the Kenmare incident, and O'Daly was behind that as well. So he had certainly displayed some sadistic tendencies, whether he had them beforehand or not, but possibly there was some acting out of trauma as a result of events he had witnessed and undertaken during his time in the squad. Frank Teeling was another very sad case who descended into alcoholism, had one conviction for manslaughter when he shot a man in a pub in Dublin in 1922 over a row about the man had put a bag of tomatoes on the counter of the pub, and Teeling didn't like this, so he shot him. He served a prison term for that. He also served a prison term later for something else. Hugo MacNeil, who went on to a career in the Irish Army, was briefly affected. He was removed from active service for a period between December 1920 and April 1921 because of his health breakdown. And given the timing, you would have to think that is an after effect of Bloody Sunday. One of the saddest cases, though, which has to be that of James Paul Norton, which, reading through his file on them in the military service pensions collection, it really is a very sad case. By July 1921, he was described as having a complete mental breakdown. In 1922, he was described as a complete mental wreck. He was committed to St. Brendan's Psychiatric Hospital in Grangegorman in 1936, where he stayed until his death in 1974. And midway through that period in 1954, he was declared a ward of court due to being of unsound mind and incapable of managing his affairs. So this evidence has only come on stream relatively recently with the result of with the release of the military service pensions campaign. But I think this new evidence is giving us an opportunity to look at a new line of inquiry with regard to the War of Independence and the Revolution generally, but also Bloody Sunday specifically. How these young men who had no training for what they did, who went and shot men dead at close range, very young men, it's hardly surprising that we find this evidence of the psychiatric impact of that on them in later years. I think another line of inquiry which has emerged recently, and I think was very visible in the centenary commemorations of Bloody Sunday, moving away from the what happened to the British officers to the events in Croke Park. One thing that strikes me about that is that we have put the human story back more into the events in Croke Park. Up until recently, we would all have known that so many civilians were killed at Croke Park, but very few of us could have named one of them, let alone all of them. And I think the research of people like Michael Foley in particular has allowed us to put more of a human face onto some of the events of Bloody Sunday. This is similar to what the RTE broadcaster Joe Duffy has done with the Children of 1916 project. And I think the documentary recently, the TV documentary on RTE1 recently, focused a lot on this, as does Michael Foley's book, The Bloodied Field. We've identified two children who were killed on that day in Croke Park, and one woman, Jane Boyle. So I think one thing I'm trying to bring across in this talk is the new evidence and the new aspects and the new perspectives that have emerged recently on what was a well-known event from Irish history, but we're now getting specifics. And one of the things One of the I think better aspects of the recent commemoration is the way in which we have been able to put names and faces to some of the casualties, and we have been able to put a bit more of a human face to the civilians particularly who died in Croke Park on that day. To get back to the bigger picture, though, I suppose one question is, well, what was the significance of all of this? What did it do? We get a very good sense from Mark Sturgis at the outset of the shock of this to the British. And many British newspapers carried excerpts like the one here depicting pictures of the men who were shot on that morning, and they carry details of their funerals as their bodies were repatriated back to Britain and were buried in a lot of cases with military honours, because of course many of them had, most of them were ex-servicemen. So I think it certainly came as a shock to the British. November 1920 had seen a rapid escalation in any event. At the start of the year, we had the execution of Kevin Barry. Later in November, there was a successful effort by the IRA in Longford to repel an attack on the village of Ballinlee, which led to the burning of Granard. Later in November, there was the ambush of the auxiliaries at Kilmichael by Tom Barry's West Cork flying column. So November 1920 saw a serious escalation in the military side of it. And one offshoot of that was also an escalation in efforts to find an exit strategy from the Irish War of Independence. The first feelers towards some sort of talks between both sides, between the Irish and the British, on one side, are some efforts to explore the possibilities of finding a peaceful solution to the conflict, had started in the autumn of 1920. When a Sinn Féin contact, Patrick Moylett, who was based in England, started to send out feelers to people on the British side. Now, nothing came of that, but the next most serious effort to bring about a peaceful solution was the peace mission of Archbishop Clune from Perth in Australia, who, at the behest of Lloyd George over the winter of 1920 and 1921, went back and forth between representatives of Sinn Féin and the British government. Now, I think Clune's peace mission was in some ways an offshoot of Bloody Sunday, in that both sides realised that things were escalating, and that increased the imperative to try and find some sort of way out of the situation they were in. Now, Clune, of course, must have had a very strong personal motivation for this. He was the uncle of Conor Clune, aforementioned Gaelic leaguer, who was tortured and killed in Dublin Castle along with McKee and Clancy on that night. Though that's not to, we don't want to overstate Clune's support for what was happening in Ireland. Part of the reason Lloyd George identified Clune as an intermediary for his peace talks was that Clune had been a chaplain to the Australian forces during the First World War. And part of the reason why Clune's mission eventually failed early in 1921 was that Sinn Féin didn't trust him. They felt he was too close to Lloyd George. Now, while Clune's peace mission failed, it was the one that came closest to any success prior to the eventual truce of July 1921. But what things like the Clune peace mission and all the other aborted efforts to find some sort of settlement in the spring of 1921 show was that there was a willingness on both sides to try to find an exit strategy, and a realization that they could not go on like that they would need to find some way of having a ceasefire and leading to talks between the two sides. The significance of Bloody Sunday from the Republican perspective as well is often painted as a great coup for Collins, and obviously it was quite a spectacular event. But again, the significance of it would not want to be overplayed. Collins had much grander ambitions for Bloody Sunday. He had intended and hoped that he would be able to get rid of more than however it was, 8 or 9 intelligence officers. He wanted a much bigger number, and he didn't manage to get that. So what we ended up with was a much smaller assault than Collins had originally planned. It did have an effect on the squad. If we look at the way in which Charlie Dalton and Hugo MacNeill and eventually by later in 1921 Norton were affected by it, it did have an impact on the squad. And as the rest of the War of Independence went on and the squad was depleted by illness and captures, and by the end, by the time of the truce in July 1921, Michael Foy, the historian of Collins's intelligence service, has shown the truce was not nearly as effective, the squad was not nearly as effective as it had been earlier on. Another serious loss for the Republican campaign for the IRA in Dublin certainly were the deaths of Dick McKee and Peadar Clancy, two of the most senior figures in the Dublin Brigade of the IRA. So while overall the events of the morning of Bloody Sunday were significant, and the fact that 100 years on they still resonate to that extent, they were not quite as effective as Collins would have liked from the outset, and there were some serious consequences which debilitated parts of the Republican movement for the rest of the War of Independence. But also, I think they should be seen as one of the factors in contributing to greater efforts to find some sort of peaceful solution. And it's for various other reasons that it took until July 1921 to achieve that. To bring Bloody Sunday, to conclude then by bringing Bloody Sunday up to the modern day. And without the centenaries have been quite interesting, the way in which they've been commemorated over the course of the past month. But even before the centenaries came along, I think this stands out as one of those landmark events in the Irish War of Independence that many people know about, even if they're not familiar with other events the historians would be familiar with. And I think in recent years, we've seen how the memory and the legacy of this event has endured. If we go back to 2007, when Lansdowne Road in Dublin was being rebuilt and Irish rugby internationals, home internationals, were moved to Croke Park, the one event which is still, I still kind of is seared in my own memory, was the match between England and Ireland at Croke Park, and the silence during the playing of God Save the Queen, and just the significance, the sense that that was something the Irish needed to deal with, and a sense of helping the Irish move on from the events which had taken place in that stadium at that stage, 87 years previously. So that was long before anybody had thought about how they would commemorate a centenary of it. And if I recall correctly, during that week, the significance of playing in Croke Park and the significance of the events of 1920 were explained before the game to the English rugby team. Now, of course, another way of looking back on this is it's nice to think of days when the Irish rugby team could actually beat England. The other emblematic event which gives us a sense of how important Croke Park still is in the wider context of Anglo-Irish relations was the fact that it was chosen as one of the sites for Queen Elizabeth's official tour to Ireland in May of 2011. And the significance, I think, of the British monarch visiting Croke Park and being, I suppose, like the English rugby team some years previously, the significance of that ground to Irish people and to Irish memory and to the previous relations between Britain and Ireland, the explanation of that to a British monarch, I think, was another moment that stands out to me in highlighting the enduring significance of this event. I think on a personal level, I don't think I quite realised how emotive Bloody Sunday was until I noticed something odd at the War Memorial Queen's University where I work a few years ago. Now, it's not unusual in November every year, Queen's hosts Remembrance Sunday, and those who lost family members in either of the two world wars, family members who are associated with Queens, will often leave these small crosses, which are provided, I think, by the Royal British Legion. And you, on the front of it, where the poppy is, you can write the name, the date on which your deceased relative lost their lives, and then on the back you can write their names. And you often find people who are Queen students or maybe Queen staff, if family members are still around, they will leave some of these crosses on the war memorial. But I was walking, and I always have, being a historian, I can't resist looking at these things. I was walking in one November morning a few years ago, and my eye was caught by one of these little crosses, and I thought that date is a little bit odd, because it says the 21st of November 1920, but the First World War was long over. So why is somebody... Why was somebody putting a cross for that date? And then when I turned it over, I saw that somebody had written on it, "In memory of those who died, killed in their beds by cowards." So I think that did take me a bit by surprise, that the events of that day still carry that level of emotion in this part of the world among certain people of certain political ideologies. So I suppose I want to conclude now by just drawing together a few thoughts on Bloody Sunday, on the event itself and its significance since. And I'm going to start at the end and work back. And I think what we've seen in the past month, I've been quite impressed by the way in which the commemorations were handled, particularly the sensitivity of the GAA's commemoration, and also the fact that they focused on what was relevant to them. The events of the morning of Bloody Sunday were not really very relevant to the GAA. So they focused on their members and their supporters who died at the events in Croke Park on that day. And I think it was handled very well and very sensitively. And this is just a still from that night when Brendan Gleeson read out the details of the victims of that night. In some ways, it was nobody expected the GAA Championship to be played at the time that these commemorative events were happening. So I think there's some unusual resonance about Dublin playing and winning a Leinster Championship in Croke Park on that night, and also, of course, Tipperary winning a Munster football final on that weekend also. So I think the commemoration has allowed us, as I say, to focus on the human side of it and to remember the civilian victims of it. The other points I think I'd make, I've tried to get across here in the lecture, was the significance of Bloody Sunday in that time, to put ourselves in the context of November 1920 and to try to forget everything we know about a truce and what happened afterwards, and to show how it came about as an escalation of the War of Independence to that point, but also the way in which it was a bit of a wake-up call to the British authorities in particular, to realising just the extent of the uprising in Ireland and the realisation that they needed to start seriously exploring ways of bringing about an end to the Irish War of Independence. I think it's important to contextualise the Bloody Sunday in terms of its significance for Collins's intelligence war as well. We can tend towards seeing it as a great success for Collins on the intelligence side, and certainly it had a very significant effect. But it's worth noting that it wasn't as significant as he would have hoped to, and it did also have a significant detrimental effect in the long run on the squad. His squad simply could not have maintained that level of activity when we look at the effect which it had on some members of the squad. And I think that's probably the last point I'd make, is when we get behind the military side of it and the tactics and the strategies, in the end what we're seeing as well is the serious effect which conflict had on people involved in it at a human level. And from the historian's point of view, that's one of the I suppose, benefits of the whole decade of centenaries is the way in which we have now had access to so much new material through archives like the military service pensions collection, which have been central to some of the evidence I've presented here. And I think that that's what fascinates me about this period of history, is the fact that there still remain so many more tales to be told of our past, to give us a sense of what happened at the time, and just to give us a broader understanding of Irish history 100 years ago.